So it's a huge privilege to welcome our speaker today and our respondent, and I will introduce them in succession, and then I will hand over to them, and they will we will run through the session, this first part, seamlessly, as I'm sure it will be. Our speaker today is Charlie Louth. I'm sure for those of you who work on German Romanticism, and those of you who are based in Oxford will undoubtedly know Charlie Louth. He's a fellow in German at Queen's College. He's an authority on German poetry, especially Hölderlin, although more recently, in fact, this year, 2020, he's just published a book called Rilke, and very interestingly, The Life of the Work 2020. So someone who, having worked on Hölderlin and writes a book called The Life of the Work, is the ideal person to come to a reception seminar, a classical reception seminar. And of course, thinking about the mind of Europe, Hölderlin is essential. And maybe we'll hear today something about Charlie's engagement, not just with the theory of translation in his work of Hölderlin, but above all, the practice of translation as well. And it will be perhaps interesting to think about how this concept of the European mind intersects with translation theory and practice. Our respondent today is Joshua Billings. Joshua teaches in classics at Princeton, spent considerable time here as a research student, first during his master's in modern languages, in specializing in German literature. And then he moved to classics to work with Oliver Taplin and me. And I was thinking this morning that, of course, it was Josh who co-convened with me the first of these faculty reception seminars, now many years ago, at a moment when it was hugely important, and I was delighted to have Josh as a comparatist to join me in this. It was really important to think about where classics sat within the wider humanities, and I think we called it classics and its relations. Josh is the perfect person to act as respondent to Charlie. He has worked on Greek literature widely and Greek philosophy, and also, broadly speaking, reception and the history of the book. And his research at doctoral level was published in 2014, The Genealogy of the Tragic. And in many ways, the chapter on Hölderlin is a centerpiece in that study. Josh is currently working on 5th century and looking in really interesting ways at how theatre is part of the wider culture and especially the life of the mind, in a book that is, I think, still tentatively called The Philosophical Stage. So I will now hand over first to Charlie, who will then in turn hand the baton to Josh. So over to you, Charlie.
Right, well, thanks very much for the invitation, and thank you everyone for coming along. It's the first time I'm giving a paper online like this, so bear with me if I make a mess of it, but I hope to manage more or less. So yes, I've called it Hölderlin's European Mind, but as you can guess, that was rather a sort of makeshift title early on. It doesn't mean very much, but okay. So Hölderlin, the German poet Hölderlin, that I'll say a little bit about, but I'm assuming that you at least roughly know who he is. But Hölderlin was fond of maps and decorated the walls of one of the rooms he occupied in Homburg around 1800 with maps of the 4 quarters of the globe, as he put it in a letter. He thought geographically, topographically, and in broad terms, one could say that his work is a mapping of his poetic world onto the real world, except that the real world was itself partly a world of the imagination, dependent on texts and myths, and often the form the world actually has, and the form it might have, are allowed to blur, so that the poems create a kind of space, or perhaps non-space, where relations between the real and the ideal, the once and the now, are able to produce a third realm of possibility, a passage between past and present. Is that okay sound-wise? Yeah, good. Hölderlin's poems also construe actual geographical features of the world, especially rivers and mountain ranges, the parts of landscape that can be read off a map. The poems construe these things for what they might suggest about the progress and the channels of civilization, for the ways they connect or divide north and south, Hellas and Hesperia. A favourite, in this sense significant river, is the Danube, which rises in Hölderlin's homeland of Swabia in southwest Germany and flows into the Black Sea, the Pontus of the ancient world. It thus seems to reverse the flow of time out of antiquity and into modernity. Linking two geographical areas, it also joins two different times or epochs, and allows one to think of having a relation, even a mutual dependency. Perhaps past and present are in closer contact than it might seem. Perhaps there are ways of bringing them together, or again, of blurring them, of creating moments when the reading mind, caught in the dynamics of the poem, somehow inhabits both, or, richly, neither. The main coordinates of Hölderlin's mental map were, of course, Greece and Germany, and his work is almost entirely devoted to an investigation of the relationships between the two and what they stand for. Meaning and salvation lie in the effective relating of them. To understand the relation, to understand as a reciprocity, is to effect the transition into fulfillment that is the point towards which all Hölderlin's writing tends, even when it guards itself against that tendency. In a late fragment, the mapping or overlaying of the ancient on the modern occurs with particular poignancy, when in the middle of a meditation on beginnings, which ends when Germany is invoked, Frankfurt is called the navel of this earth, borrowing the Greek appellation for Delphi. And the quotation now is on the handout. Frankfurt aber, nach der Gestalt, die Ausdruck ist der Natur zu reden, des Menschen nämlich, ist der Nabel dieser Erde, dieser Zeit auch die Zeit und deutschen Schmelzes. In David Constantine's translation, this goes, that Frankfurt, to speak of it after man's, the print of nature's shape, is this earth's navel. These times too are time and coloured German. Hölderlin makes this connection because, as the poem hints, Frankfurt is where the notably beautiful Suzette Gontard, the woman he loved, lived, but perhaps prompted also by the fact that Frankfurt lies at least roughly in the middle of the German territories. Using the Greek term is a hopeful way of treating the present, arguing that it might have a comparable significance, a focus such as Delphi. But in the boldness of the claim, Frankfurt aber, it also exposes the desire that such a thing might be true, and so acknowledges how unlikely it is, or to put it another way, how purely personal. Frankfurt may be the Earth's omphalos for Hölderlin, but this is nothing like the shared cultural significance of Delphi. By mapping one on the other, Hölderlin wills a correspondence, but reveals an absolute discrepancy, and he does both at once. But it's also a little more complex. In wanting to make Frankfurt an omphalos, Hölderlin seems to be replacing the divine reason for regarding Delphi as the Earth's centre point with a human one. It is because of the perfect human shape Frankfurt is inhabited by. And this shape, this print of nature, emphatically human, des Menschen nämlich, is also the mark of a continuity between ancient Greece and modern Germany, a reminder that beauty still exists, that not everything has changed. What has changed, though, is the shift in focus away from the divine and towards the human, and towards a different view of the earth. Frankfurt is der Nabel dieser Erde, so der Nabel dieser Erde, the navel of this earth, a reminder that we are dealing with one and the same earth, but not from the same perspective. The following words can continue this train of thought. This time too is time, meaning that a world fit for an omphalos obtains here and now too, and even insofar as it is Deutschen Schmelzes, the moment has come for it to take on a German form. That might seem to imply that the time of a particularly German destiny has arrived, but it seems better, and truer to Hölderlin's thinking overall, to take it to mean that the present time, diese Zeit, for the German poet, necessarily has a German makeup, because it cannot exist either independently of a given manifest form or as a Greek surrogate. Hölderlin translates the Greek word omphalos, by my count 4 times. First in Pindar, where on 2 occasions, despite the literalizing tendency of the translation as a whole, he translated most of Pindar's Olympian and Pythian odes, he goes for Mittelpunkt, so midpoint. Those translations were done in 1800, probably in the room decorated with maps. When he comes to translate Sophocles a few years later, he writes Mitte der Erd for Ptolemy's Omphalagas in Oedipus Rex, and then at last der Erde Nabel later on in Oedipus Rex. And it's probably only after that that he begins to use it in his own poems, though the precise chronology is hard to establish exactly, because those translations and the poems with instances of Nabel in them are all within 2 or 3 years, let's say. Hölderlin's work as a translator focused above all on Pindar and Sophocles, and we can think of translation in this context as another kind of mapping. The ancient texts are treated like the lineaments of a landscape. They are vital traces which have survived from better times, effectively sacred texts. In translating them, Hölderlin is seeking not so much to transpose them from one language into another, though of course in a sense he is doing this, but to lay his language, German, over the Greek to see what correspondences can be found. The implicit dream is of a coherence or coincidence of the 2 languages, the localizing of places where there is simply a continuity between Greek and German, a point of contact. These would be moments when the adjusting of German away from its normal usage in response to the pressure of the Greek would correspond exactly to an opening up of the understanding of the Greek, revealing a reciprocity which is an instance of an enduring living relation between antiquity and modernity, but also an annulment of specificity, a place neither Greek nor German, but in some sense both. In an essay fragment which considers our relationship to antiquity, written probably just before turning to his radical translation of Pindar, Hölderlin solves the apparent dilemma of either being crushed by the weight of classical example, on the one hand, or rebelling against it and seeking to overthrow it, on the other, by proposing something he calls reelle Wechselvereinigung, which might be translated as real reciprocal relation, or more forcefully as real symbiotic unification. The Pindar translation as a whole, and the moments in it where a coincidence is found in particular, can be regarded as an attempt to put this idea into practice. But instead of Pindar, I'd like to look very briefly at Hölderlin's Sophocles, not from the 2 plays he did entire, Oedipus Rex and Antigone, but a few lines from Oedipus at Kolonos, which remains, and probably all that he did from that play. though his intention at one point seems to have been to translate all of Sophocles' tragedies. So this, i.e. what follows, is rather speculative, but it's a way of returning to the idea of place touched on earlier. Hölderlin's poetic procedure and his way of translating as creating a certain kind of open space. Oedipus at Kolonos is notably preoccupied by place, by Kolonos as a holy site, and as a place for Oedipus to die. In Hölderlin's translation of Antigone's lines for the beginning of the play, so that's also on the handout, and then there's also the Greek on the other one, if anyone wants to look at that. But these lines go, Die Stätte aber ist, wie leicht zu denken, heilig. Vom Lorbeer rauscht und Ölbaum sie, ein Weinstock. Dicht fliegend drin in ihr wohllauten Nachtigallen. Und die Gelenke beugt am harten Fels sie hin. David Constantine's version. The place, however, as may well be thought, is holy. It rustles with laurels and with the olive and the vine. In it, densely flocking, nightingales sound sweet, and it bends its limbs up the hard rock and around. In the last line here, which David Constantine translates perhaps rather oddly, Hölderlin, against the Greek, makes the place, the Stätte in German, the subject. It is the place itself that bends the joints. This could be taken to mean that it is a place where you are liable to twist your ankle, or possibly Constantine's reading is right and Gelenke is being used figuratively of the landscape. In any case, the place has an active power in German that it doesn't have grammatically in the Greek. In the Greek, Antigone is just telling Oedipus to sit down for a rest. Hölderlin also translated a few more lines from a little further on, and they are also concerned with the nature of the place. So Oedipus says, Was ist für eine Gegend, welchem Gott gehört sie? And der Wanderer, the traveler, replies, Unantastbar, unwohnbar, denn die schüchternen Göttinnen haben sie, der Erde Jungfrauen und der Nacht. Wer ist's, den reinen Namen möchte ich hören? Die Allerschauenden, die Eumeniden. So spricht hier das Volk. Ein anderes ist anderswo schön. Dass gnädig sie aufnehmen diesen Beter, dass ich von diesem Sitz nie, diesem Boden scheide. And Constantine, what manner of place is this? Which god does it belong to? Untouchable, uninhabitable, for the shy goddesses have it, maidens of the earth and of the night. Who are they? Their pure name I should like to hear. They who see all things, the Eumenides. So say the people here, other things are lovely elsewhere. May they be gracious and take in this supplicant, that never from this abode, this ground, I shall depart. The place we have arrived at is, it seems, a kind of non-place, not to be touched and not to be inhabited. As a place in a text, the German has lifted it out of the Greek, but not wholly. Ein anders ist anderswo schön. Another is otherwhere fine, words that keep very close to the Greek. This can be read too as hinting at the elsewhere of translation and at the transformations that occur as things pass from one language to another, so at the transaction that is taking place. Hölderlin too is preparing a place, a sacred, hard to define place for Oedipus to die, and also a place where Greek and German come together. Lastly, let's turn to the poem Germanien, one of Hölderlin's late poems, which is trying to make sense of Germany's position at the heart of Europe. It's a Pindaric hymn, so already we have an overlaying of two forms, a Greicizing of German poetry and a Germanizing of Greek, an ancient form and a modern subject. There's only time to look at the interrelating of Greece and Germany in the opening lines, which again are on your handout, of course. So the poem begins like this. Nicht sie, die Seligen, die erschienen sind, die Götterbilder in dem alten Lande. Sie darf ich ja nicht rufen mehr, wenn aber ihr heimatlichen Wasser jetzt mit euch des Herzens Liebe klagt, was will es anders, das heilig Trauernde? Denn voll Erwartung liegt das Land, als in heißen Tagen herabgesenkt, umschattet heut ihr Sehnenden uns ahnungsvoll ein Himmel. Constantine, not those, the blessed, the living images of the gods who appeared once in the ancient land. Of course I'm not anymore, yet when you waters of home with you the heart's love grieves, what else does it desire? What else is it in holy mourning for? The land lies full of expectation, and as in days of heat, lowering, full of portent, the sky today lays a shadow over the yearning. The title Germanien evokes a place which does not exist, Germania, and the poem begins by turning away from the old land of Greece. But unable to do so, what desires, sung with the waters of home over an absence, seems to be nothing other than Greek antiquity itself. Das anders, what else can it want? Even though that phrase also shades over into why want something else, so it seems momentarily to confuse allegiance with rejection. The main point is that the only way in which the present can be imagined as fulfilled is by remembering the forms of the past. Although the lines that follow evoke Germany, the expectation the Land or land holds is for something also in the past. And the grammar, again, at least for a moment, leaves the reader uncertain land is in fact in question. The poem continuously allows the two to blur, so that as the poem later has it, keiner weiß, was ihm geschieht. No one knows what's happening to them. The poem as a whole creates a space in which antiquity and modernity can converse. What Hölderlin sometimes thinks of, and here I hand over to Josh, as a Vaterland, somewhere that may not exist at all, but which represents the possibility of ancient and modern coming together. So in Germanien, that most German of words, Vaterland, is implicitly reinterpreted as a way of mapping Germany and Greece over one another to create what Josh, in his discussion of Hölderlin's conception of Vaterland, calls a third state. Thank you.
Thank you, Charlie, for that wonderful paper. And I'll just pick up right where Charlie left off, but first should say thank you to Fiona and Claire for organizing this, and it's so nice to see everyone, and strange to do it at a time when I'm usually drinking my first cup of coffee in my bathroom. So I'm going to pick up on the idea of a conversation between antiquity and modernity mapped onto the space of the Vaterland. Charlie's paper points to the intensely local geographical aspect of Hölderlin's thought, even or maybe especially at the point that it is at its most imaginary. He describes Hölderlin preparing a place where Greek and German come together. And that place is importantly a place in the future, which Hölderlin, I think, imagines in poetry creating the space for, creating the possibility for, but which is, in Hölderlin's thought, something that can really be actualized in some imagined future. And that future is articulated around the concept of the Vaterland. It's not a single geography, or certainly not a single political collective, but an ideal state that merges past and present and represents the harmonious coexistence of people in space and time, a sense of being at home that may be impossible in one's actual home. And the term in Hölderlin it was misappropriated under National Socialism as pointing to the present political collective, to some actual existent fatherland, as a sort of nationalistic conception. And it's hard not to feel discomfort, especially right now, as we're in the middle of a very common election. And I don't think I can explain away this discomfort. But one way that I think we can think about it, and what might be a more positive way of understanding it, as well as a historically sensitive one, would be to think that the Vaterland for Hölderlin is a kind of political utopia that is far more of the left than of the right, and which may have something valuable to offer us today at another moment of massive cultural transformation. Early on in Hölderlin's life, the term for him is emphatically political, and it points to what hope will emerge from a people's revolution inspired by the French Revolution. As his hopes in the French Revolution and Bonaparte fade, he internalizes the state. It comes to be some kind of imagined ideal state where that would point to the gap between the present and a desired or idealized collective that would combine ancient and modern, and as Charlie discussed, inhabit that open space where Greek and German come together. So my small footnote to Charlie's paper is just to think some more about the coordinates of the engagement with the Vaterland in the Oedipus at Colonus, which is a uniquely Vaterlandish work for Hölderlin. He actually translated the Athens Ode from the Oedipus at Colonus, where the chorus welcomes Oedipus to Athens somewhat earlier in 1796, 1797, a moment of intense revolutionary patriotism. And so seems to be thinking about the Athens that Oedipus arrives at as something like the desired state of political activity that he hopes will emerge. And then he uses the famous line, "Not to be born is the best of all," from one of the later choralodes as the epigraph to his novel Hyperion, the second volume, which is a text about a disappointed search for a modern Greek Vaterland, one from revolution. And then there's finally the idea, which you find in the notes of Sophocles, and which I think must be informing the translation, that the Oedipus at Colonus is an importantly modern work, a Vaterlandish work in its use of language. The Vaterland, I think, is always a place one comes back to for the first time, like Oedipus recognizing Colonus as the place where he will die, not the home where he was born, that welcomes him and where he belongs. And in some ways for Hölderlin, those two homes have to be different ones. He's always drawn, Hölderlin, to arrivals and is obsessed with the idea of Dionysus's arrival, translates the opening of the Bacchae, and sees that kind of arrival as the arrival of a moment of political, social, cultural revolution. Oedipus's recognition of the grove of the humanities, I think, offers Hölderlin a kind of model for an understanding of one's own Vaterland. And I just am going to the very next line in Hölderlin's translation in the Greek. The stranger asks, "Was ist das? Tieste tuto?" And Oedipus answers, and I'm going to try to put this in the chat, "Meines Schicksals Inbegriff," which Constantine translates, "very essence of my fate, sum foras sun thememes." I've always been quite struck by this line and thought quite a lot about it. That preposition sun in the Greek is doing the same work in both words, pointing to joining or meeting. Synthema is literally placed or set together, the word for a token or covenant, and symphora, bringing together. In Oedipus, in much of Greek literature, is used largely to describe negative things that are happening. Symphora is a catastrophe, and the word here to describe Oedipus is quite ambiguous. Oedipus's symphora had been this sort of awful conjunction of roles of father and brother, son and husband. Now his symphora turns out to be a different function, the space where human and divinity come together and where Oedipus will become or look forward to life as a cult hero in Athens. The line represents a moment of spatial recognition, that the geography of Oedipus's tortured wandering here and now coincides with the geography of his death and ultimate heroization. What had seemed like errancy turns out to be a meaningful path. And I think that idea of recognition of the end point of errancy is profoundly resonant for Hölderlin. And his translation of this line, meines Schicksals in Begriff, internalizes the process. In Begriff is the essence of something. Very essence of my fate is about as good as we can probably do in English. Schicksal, a standard word for fate, but literally something sent, is what Oedipus recognizes in the spot as he understands how past and future relate. My suggestion is that Hölderlin sees the Vaterland as his own Schicksals in Begriff, the essence of his fate, the future state where Greek and German come together in language and thought, and what the example of the Oedipus at Colonus and also from Germanien shows us is that this state, even though futural and imaginary, is also intensely local, geographical, and tangible. Oedipus's Athens is Hölderlin's Danube. Hölderlin never went to Athens, but he was fascinated with its spaces and describes the modern city full of ancient ruins in that novel Hyperion that I mentioned. Thinking about the modern layered over the ancient in Greece, and then in the novel, in Hölderlin's translation, over modern Germany. There's a kind of spatial layering that I think connects us back to the four quarters of the globe that Charlie began with, and gives us a way of thinking about Hölderlin's European mind as a map in 3 dimensions, a plotting of pregnant geographies where past and present coincide in some desired future. And I'll stop there.